Ms. Wolarski is recognized to speak in her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Biden and the Democrats are turning the child tax credit on its head by completely detaching the credit from earnings and work in an unprecedented attempt to use the IRS to distribute cash welfare at a cost of a whopping $556 billion. This is the most expensive item on the Democrats' tax hikes and spending spree wish list. These payments will flow with no strings attached, regardless of whether the recipient earned any income or worked. America's needy families need to be paying jobs, not more emergency spending and endless government checks. My amendment would reinstate the $2,500 earnings work requirement and ensure that income from CTC counts towards eligibility for federal means-tested benefit programs. Democrats keep telling us that this policy to send monthly checks to non-earner, non-working households with children is needed to decrease child poverty. It's as though American taxpayers are not already funding a social safety net of more than 80 programs to the tune of $1 trillion as a commitment to reducing child poverty and helping those in need. As I said last week, all these new programs and expansions are just piled up on top of a broken, fragmented system that's already failing our nation's most vulnerable children and families. But instead of doing the hard work to streamline, modernize, and redesign our safety net, Democrats want to double down on helicopter cash. Americans are incredibly generous. We want to see families uplifted. At the same time, our nation was forged through hard work and personal responsibility. These values are the very foundation upon which our nation was built. We all know that families, particularly the children in those families, do best when parents are connected to jobs and on the path to success. But this bill goes in the opposite direction. No number of endless government checks, no matter how well intentioned, can address the underlying challenges that could be holding a family back from success. While Democrats want to keep paying people to stay home, Republicans are putting forth pro-work, pro-growth solutions to help individuals find and keep family-sustaining jobs. Instead of tethering those in poverty to government checks, we should be empowering these individuals to seize greater opportunity and success for themselves and their children. The dignity of work is the key to uplifting families and unlocking the American dream. As Senator Manchin said about CTC changes in this bill over the weekend, there's no work requirement whatsoever. There's no education requirements whatsoever. I think Senator Manchin would support my amendment, and so Democrats on this committee, I would ask. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Washington State on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's disappointing again to hear folks talk about families who are struggling to get by as being lazy. We have many families who want to work but are still looking for childcare, for safe childcare, who are concerned about impacts of the pandemic if they're immunocompromised. And a big success of the American Rescue Plan in helping families was the expanded child tax credit. To make sure that we are helping families, helping make sure we have great outcomes for our children. And work requirements are problematic in a pandemic because of the challenges that families face, as I outline. This is about helping our kids. Also, it's interesting that my Republican colleagues talk about means testing in some way. Actually, in the American Rescue Plan, we adjusted the child tax credit income thresholds that were set by Republicans before in their tax law. They had phase-out thresholds at $400,000 for joint filers and $200,000 for single filers or head of household. We moved those down in the American Rescue Plan to $150,000 for joint filers and $112,500 for head of household to make sure that we targeted families who needed it the most. We also addressed a big issue that existed in the Republican tax plan that left out a third of families a third of children whose parents didn't make enough to earn the full benefit. And as a result, we ended up with a refundable tax credit and checks going out. In fact, the third checks went out today to families to help them support their children. And we're already seeing an incredible impact in terms of parents being able to provide food for their children and over 3 million children being lifted out of poverty. So if we're going to make a statement about how we're going to help our children, how we're going to help families, we really need to make sure that we are being smart about the investments, and the child tax credit gives us an incredible return. In fact, in Congresswoman Walorski's district, 30% of the kids were left behind before the American Rescue Plan because we did not have a refundable credit. So if we want to get resources to families who need it the most, to the children who need it the most, then absolutely making sure that we do a great job like we did in the American Rescue Plan and like we do in this legislation, extending that is important. Lastly, I want to say that when we talk about work and workforce, one of the most important things we can do is make sure our kids have great outcomes. That's how we build a strong workforce in our country. That means making sure kids grow up healthy, and have access and are able to a great education, are able to succeed. And we know through all the data on the child tax credit, for every dollar we invest, we save $8 because we get better outcomes for our kids. That's better economic outcomes, but we know we also have better outcomes in the quality of life for our children. That gives us a thriving economy going forward. So if we want to invest in our workforce and in the future of our country, this is also a strong investment. So the economic benefits, the benefits to our kids, the benefits we've already seen just since we've implemented this program for the last couple months have been tremendous. Let's continue to cut child poverty in half, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
I thank the gentlelady. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to point out about the benefits of the American Rescue Plan, benefits of unemployment fraud, where anywhere between, according to independent sources, $100 billion to $400 billion, up to half of the total money has been stolen because of lack of requirements to prove eligibility. Inflation up to 8% per year because of this massive giveaway programs that have devalued our dollar, and it's a tax on everybody from the top to the bottom, paying people not to work so that we have 10 million unfilled jobs that is slowing our economy and creating government dependence. So I just wanted to make sure that we were all fully aware of these spectacular benefits of the American Rescue Plan. Again, the difference between the progressive agenda and the conservatives is progressives believe that the government has to take care of you, that you're unable to make your own decisions and take care of yourself. I yield back.
The gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak in opposition to the proposed amendment. And I want to really commend my colleague from Washington State for her tremendous leadership, and other members who have worked on this child tax credit, which is actually a tax cut for middle-class families. And I really take offense to my colleagues on the other side. They talk about tax credits and tax cuts for billionaires and corporations, but when we want to provide a tax cut and a tax benefit for families, they want to object and they want to means test it. Well, I'm not going to support a means test that benefits 98% of the children in my district who are benefiting from this child tax cut from the American Rescue Plan. That's 177,000 children in my district alone. So while you may want to provide tax cuts to the wealthy, I actually want to provide tax cuts to middle-class families and their children, and allow them to use those tax cuts to do what? To put food on the table, to help them provide, to cover expenses for back to school. Several of my constituents shared with me that they literally use their advance payment, that $300 advance payment, in order to cover a doctor visit so that they could get eyeglasses for their child as they return to school. And one told me that they took them to the dentist so that their child could get the cavity fixed in their mouth so it doesn't hurt while they're learning. That's what we're fighting for in this legislation. And somehow now you want to means test it, to deny the benefit for the 98% of the children in my district, to give tax breaks to the very wealthy and the big corporations? Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record 2 articles, one from Reuters, which published a story, Biden's child tax credit pays big in Republican states popular with voters.
Without objection.
And a second from The Economist, which ran a piece, America is substantially reducing poverty among children.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I said this the other day. We may be from different districts, but the realities are the same. And while you may not vote to provide a tax cut to middle-class families with children, I will. I will do it for the children and the families in my district, and sadly, I will be voting to provide that tax cut for the children and the families in your district that you refuse to. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady.
I'll be very brief. I appreciate the passion, but I appreciate accuracy more. I would note that Republicans in Congress created the child tax credit. It has had bipartisan support because it was tied to work. It was part of the incentives to reconnect Americans to jobs, help lift up people out of poverty. And regrettably, while you are very supportive of this one, you voted unanimously against doubling the child tax credit and expanding it in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, including increased refundability. Our request here is simply to return this to an incentive to encourage people to reconnect to work so that their children see them working and we can lift more Americans out of poverty. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a microphone check. Can you hear me this time?
We can hear you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I believe the child tax credit is absolutely critical for families, not just in my district on the Central Coast of California, but all across this country. And I believe that the CTC, the child tax credit, does not need work requirements because this largely affects families that already want to work. It benefits single mothers, though, who can't work. It benefits the immunocompromised family members who can't work. The child tax credit also is means tested in that the phase out starts at $150,000 per income. But middle class families in my district do rely on this as well. The child tax credit can cut child poverty in half, but what we got to realize is that with the American Rescue Plan, that's what we're going to be overseeing. We're going to be overseeing, because of the extension and expansion of the child tax credit, we're going to see the largest ever decrease in child poverty in the history of the United States. In July, just in July, child poverty was 41% lower than normal. It dropped 15.8% in June to 11.9%. Basically, that's a decline of over 3 million children living in poverty. Now, what's unfortunate is that our safety net in the United States is one of the thinnest, in that basically we spend 0.6% of our GDP on child and family benefits, compared to 2.1% average of other OECD countries. So basically, we don't need to complicate this any further. We need to make sure that we continue to reduce our child poverty, and we're doing it with the child tax credit as is. That's why I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield
recognize Mr. Thompson first. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Albany.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter for more than 400 economists, including Jason Furman and Betsy Stevenson, who've been pushing for a permanent expansion of the expanded child tax credit in the from the American Rescue Plan. They say, quote, a permanently expanded child tax credit would yield tremendous immediate and long-term benefits for children and their families and would be unlikely to meaningfully reduce employment, end quote.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Thompson.
Ms. Plaskett, would you like to be recognized?
Yes, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's so interesting to me, the requirement that individuals work that our colleagues are so interested in. I wonder if there was a requirement to the billionaires to work when they gave them stock buybacks and tax breaks in the Tax Jobs Cut Act that they had. We know that what our plan is going to work. We know that 1 in 6 children in America live in poverty. In 2018, that was 12 million children. That was 12 million children under the plan that the Republicans had before the child tax credit, which has cut in half child poverty in our country. If that is not enough incentive to good Americans that children not live in poverty, I don't know what is. We are bringing home ownership, the American dream. We talk about innovation. Wealth creation comes from home ownership, and that's what this bill is looking towards, the home ownership that many of us don't have. I know that my colleague means well when she says that that's how America started, by its own individuals working hard and doing. We know that that's not the truth. America was founded in many instances by exploitation of other people, by having slaves, by exploiting Native American people. Those are the things that built this country in many respects. Let's not be disabused of the truth of what founded this country. Not to say that we are not still the greatest country in the world. Let's not be rose-colored eyeglasses as to the truth of what this country is. We are working to bring equity in this country and bring a means for the middle class, not the wealthy class, to be able to have the innovation that my colleagues are so interested in keeping in America. And I oppose the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentlelady. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, would like to be recognized on the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, we all want to help our fellow Americans that fall on hard times, but for the grace of God, go any of us at any time. I think those who are working hard to make ends meet and still struggling, I don't think one American I've met, Republican or Democrat, doesn't want to help people. I was envisioned by the founders and enshrined in the Constitution was not to have the federal government be the end-all be-all answer to all the problems and the safety net for all these very real challenges. And in fact, I would suggest that the federal government is the least efficient and least effective way to provide support for people and families who need it. And so I want to harken back now to 1996 when Democrat president of our country was also providing leadership to provide these or enact these long overdue reforms. He said in his remarks when the welfare to work reforms passed, he said that today Congress will voted on legislation that would give folks a chance to live up to the promise to transform a broken system that traps too many people in a cycle of dependence, to one that emphasizes work and independence, to give people on welfare a chance to draw a paycheck, not a welfare check. It gives us a better chance to give those on welfare what we want for all families in America, the opportunity to succeed at home and at work. He went on to say, a long time ago, I concluded that the current welfare system undermines the basic values of work, responsibility, and family, trapping generation after generation after generation in dependency and hurting the very people it was designed to help. And I'll stop there, but the fact that Americans are generous and we want to help folks who need it. But I think it is a basic and expectation for people who receive and beneficiaries of the generosity of Americans to have to be looking for work or to be working. So that to me is basic. And now we're going pre-1996 welfare to work reform. When people can get cash money who don't work but are able to work and who are not paying any taxes, and again, able-bodied, I think that's just flat out wrong. I don't think that's compassionate. I think it's a disservice to both the people receiving that cash benefit and the taxpayers alike. So, Mr. Chairman, I think we are, again, building backwards. And oh, by the way, when people say we're doing this, creating this new cash entitlement, which is going to cost $500 billion because we want to help children, I want you to tell me how you're going to help my children and my grandchildren and your great grandchildren who will inherit the whirlwind with the wind of policy investments and program expansions that will be unpaid by us, but will be borne out in trillions of dollars in debt on our posterity. Future Americans will not have the liberty and the opportunities we had because children in the future will not pay for the deferred taxes that is the debt that we are amassing today because of these policies that are broken on so many levels. That's just one of them. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman has yielded back his time. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer, is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. I want to point out that when we talk about a third of the children who are left behind because their parents didn't make enough to receive the full benefit until the American Rescue Plan, in Mr. Arrington's district, 44% of the children in his district were left behind prior to the change, and in Mr. Brady's district, 33% of children in his district were left behind. We know already since the American Rescue Plan, 3.3 million more parents have been able to provide enough food to feed their children, and 3 million children have been kept out of poverty. Incredible progress in just the couple months that's been in place. We need to keep moving forward. We make a huge difference for children and help kids whose families had been left behind based on the previous policy. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair is prepared to call the question. The question is on agreeing to the amendment. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for a voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
You told him I wanted to.
Ask for a recorded
Mr. Brady has requested a recorded vote, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett?
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson?
Thompson, no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer? No. Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kind?
Kind, no.
Mr. Kind votes no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Davis?
No.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell? Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu?
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle?
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer?
Okay, guys.
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans? Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider?
Votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi? No. Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy?
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez?
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed?
Reed votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Aye. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri?
Smith votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice?
Aye.
Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert votes aye. Ms. Walorski?
Walorski votes aye.
Ms. Walorski votes aye. Mr. LaHood?
Yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Wenstrup?
Yes.
Dr. Wenstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington?
Yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr.
Aye.
Mr.
Aye.
Smucker?
Would you turn your camera on, Mr. Schmucker?
It's on. I vote aye. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We'd love to see you, too.
That's the
I don't
best
know.
I've seen.
It's on from my end. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, no, that's, okay, we'll proceed.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn?
Hearn votes aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller?
Aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell votes no. Ms. Sewell?
No.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Would the clerk report the tally?
Mr. Chairman, I have 25 nays and 18 ayes.
There being 25 nays and 18 ayes, the amendment fails. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Smucker?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Thompson?
I reserve a point of order.
Mr. Thompson has reserved a point of order. The gentleman will be recognized as soon as the amendment is passed out.
And you can see me now, Mr. Chair?
No, I really can't, but proceed.
Okay, proceed now.
Wait 1 second more.
Okay.
All right, you're good.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Democrats have spent the past few days talking about how to make the tax code fairer. But in typical fashion, many provisions of this bill apply only to a segment of the workforce. And I'm talking about the segment that is unionized. And in some cases, it also applies only to unionized companies. This is not uncommon. This is, as I said, typical for Democrats. Now, I'll start by saying, I support workers being able to unionize. I support unions being able to negotiate with companies. I believe that every worker should have the opportunity to join a union if they so choose. And I also believe that every worker should not be forced to join a union if they don't want to do so. And what I am opposed to is provisions from the federal government or government at any level that prioritize doing business with a union company or that require that a worker must be part of a union to participate in some of the benefits. And in this way, this bill is full of areas where only a union member would benefit and a non-union member would not be able to benefit. So for instance, some of the tax credits, this bill coerces companies to either hire union workers or even unionize by dangling these green tax credits, and that's the only way they can participate in that. Now, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, only 10% of employees belonged to unions last year. That's around 14 million. That's a very small portion of the workforce. Why do Democrats do this? Part of the use for union dues is for political contributions. And I've looked up a few of the largest labor unions and looked up their political contributions. This includes the American Federation of Teachers, IBEW, SEIU, Teamsters. It's to name just a few. And more than 95% of their political giving goes to Democrat. For some of those, by the way, it was 100%. Now, they can choose where to give. But what I want the American people to know is that what too often is motivating Democrats to include handouts to the unions, like we see in this bill, is because of those political contributions. This bill goes a step further. It allows union members to deduct their union dues from their gross income. Now, this is even before they take a standard deduction. In other words, they can still take the standard deduction that any worker could, but the union dues are deducted from the gross income before that, which means that essentially this bill is asking the taxpayers to subsidize some of those union dues. Remember, a lot of that union due money goes to political giving. So this bill is asking taxpayers to subsidize political giving of the unions that goes to our Democrat colleagues. It's wrong. And it, by the way, does not protect the union dues. This will incentivize unions to be able to raise their dues as well. And it doesn't protect workers from those hikes in dues. And those dues, by the way, are often used to pay lavish salaries. The president of the American Federation of Teachers, who's a good friend of the Biden administration, the salary exceeds $400,000 a year. The National Association of Government Employees, Teamsters, earn about the same. The president of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers earns compensation of over $477,000 per year. National Education Association, $429,000 a year. This is pretty close to the top 1% of income earners in the nation, and I could go on. But what makes it even worse, this provision only applies to union members. We have right to work states. By the way, this bill also seeks to undo all of the state right to work laws. It's federal government's imposition of its views. It's Democrats' imposition of their catering to the unions and overturning state laws. But this particular deduction in the bill would only apply to union members. In my state, if you're a non-union member, we're not a right to work state, but if you're a non-union member, you are still required, you're forced to pay dues when you work at a union shop. But that's not deductible for you. That can't be deducted from your income just like a union member. So it's unfair. Again, Democrats talk throughout this bill of being fair, but they continue to be very, very unfair in terms of how these provisions are applied to union and non-union workplaces. So I'll say it again. I said it yesterday, and I'll say it again. Rather than find new ways to make union membership more attractive for employees and allow them to choose that, unions are running to Congress to force their organizations through bills like this on the American workforce. So for the sake of fairness,
gentleman.
I urge adoption of this amendment.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I've been too passionate about speaking on behalf of my constituents, I'll try to keep my comments less passionate. I'm sorry, but when I talk on behalf of my constituents, no, I'm not sorry. I'm doing what I was elected to do, which is to represent my constituents. And another group of constituents that I was elected to represent are the hardworking people who actually built the middle class. And those are the people who belong to unions. And I'm speaking against this amendment because it goes against the very ideals of what it means to give voice to workers. Now, as someone who, again, led one of the largest employment and training organizations in Nevada, I've worked with labor and with management to help train and place thousands of people, and so I understand the role of both. But this particular amendment actually goes against the ideals of what it means to give workers an even hand in this process. Why? Because employers, especially large corporations, they get the upper hand at the negotiating tables for many reasons, including their ability to write off or deduct management and legal costs, such as those involved in resisting unionization campaigns and negotiating with unions. So my colleague from the other side is proposing an amendment that would deny the benefit for workers that large corporations currently get under the tax code. So instead of balancing the playing field, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act further tilted the scales against workers by eliminating the deduction for unreimbursed employee expenses including union dues. So while they gave tax breaks to the very wealthy and big corporations, they actually eliminated the deduction for unreimbursed employee expenses. This provision would re-level the playing field and restore the incentive for workers to seek basic rights of fair pay and benefits. And that's ultimately what belonging to a union is really all about, is having a voice, a collective voice, to bargain for better wages, better work conditions, safer work environments, to be able to have access to good quality health care and retirement. These are the things that have built the middle class. And when my colleague from the other side talks about unions representing a smaller percentage of the workforce, that's because we have eroded their ability to negotiate in fairness at the negotiating table. So I would urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, to support the rights of workers, to restore their voice at the bargaining table, and to re-level the playing field, to give the American worker the benefit, not big corporations.
Will the
And I
gentleman
back.
yield? Will the gentleman yield? Mr. Horsford, will you yield? Ms. Sanchez is asking.
I will yield to Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you. For all of the reasons that Mr. Horsford has articulated, I also oppose this amendment, but also this amendment shows a glaring lack of understanding of what union dues can and cannot be used for. My colleague on the other side of the aisle who introduced the amendment said that it was used for, that union dues were used for political purposes or political contributions, and that's simply not the case. The law does not allow union dues to be used for any kind of political giving. That is a separate fund that union members can choose to participate in if they want to do political giving, but their basic union dues cannot be used for any kind of political purposes. So the author of the amendment has a lack of understanding of exactly what union dues legally can and cannot be used for, and I could not let this amendment pass without pointing that out, because it's an utterly false statement to say that it's used for political giving. And with that, I will yield back to the gentleman from Nevada.
The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair would recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am opposed to tampering with union rights. I urge a no vote, and I yield back.
The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, is recognized on the amendment.
I don't want to tamper with union rights either, but I don't want to subsidize their dues. You know, as a part of the American Rescue Plan, I keep hearing that we made children, you know, took children out of poverty. Well, what we did was we borrowed from those children and we gave them a little bit of the money back. And under my definition, that doesn't take them out of poverty. That just moves their poverty a little farther in the future. Actually, with the American Rescue Plan, we borrowed $5,500 for every man, woman, and child in the country. And part of that money we spent on bailing out union pension plans. And the reason we bailed them out is because the tax code gives union pension plans a much more preferential rate than they do anybody else's pension plan. You see, unions can contribute to their plans about 60% of what other plans have to, and as a result, they're underfunded, and as a result, we bailed them out. You guys bailed them out as part of payoff to your donors. You bailed out the union pension plans in the American Rescue Plan at the cost per taxpayer of about, I think it was about $170 for every man, woman, and child in the country. That's what they paid to bail out your union buddies. Now, this is another subsidy of the United States government. If we allowed them to write off their dues above the line, there's another subsidy for union dues. And what I don't understand, I don't want to tamper with union rights. I think unions can compete with non-union states just fine. But what I don't want to do is give them tax preferences to do it. What I don't want to do is give people in South Carolina, force them to subsidize union dues for blue states. That is not right. It is not fair. It doesn't belong in the tax code. And for that reason, I support this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that the alleged title of this bill, the American Taxpayer Before Union Executives and Lobbyists Amendment, is misstated, that this is really the American taxpayer versus the American workers, which is confusing because the American workers, even those who belong to unions, are also the American taxpayers. And I'm confused. This is clearly a work-related expense, and I would say far more legitimate than business lunches or business dinners or first-class travel or anything else that's allowed to be deducted right now. Also, second, that the argument that union benefits go only to Democrats is as silly as claiming that the tax cuts of the TCJA only went to Republicans, when we never alleged that. Finally, I think it's a huge misreading of the U.S. body politic to think that every union member is a Democrat. Union members are far more complicated and interesting than simply belonging to one party. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Smucker.
Mr. Kelly yields his time to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Mr. Kelly for yielding. Just like to respond to a few. So one of the first comments was in regards to the tax benefits. I believe unions are nonprofits, and in that regard, do not pay federal tax. In many cases, they probably don't even pay property tax. So I think they are receiving a similar tax benefit to what the businesses would be receiving. In regards to the political dues, unions clearly pay a lot of dues. That money comes from, pay a lot of contributions, political contributions. They have to get that money from somewhere. They also fund super PACs. And to Mr. Byer's point, I didn't say that all contributions go to Democrats, but about 95% do. That's just a fact. I think Democrats implement policy as a result of those contributions that help a very small portion of the workforce, to the point that I made earlier. And I want unions to have the rights. I think most employees, what I prefer, what I've done as a small business owner, we created an ownership culture where when everyone did well together as a company, everyone benefited. Every worker, from the front line, every single worker, hundreds of workers, all benefited when we all worked together and the company did well. Many workers prefer to work in an environment where they are partners with the company ownership. And in fact, I'm a big fan of ownership plans like ESOPs and so on, where there really is the true ownership that employees participate in. But most companies treat their employees very, very well. Employees are pleased with the arrangement, but that's not always true. And so I think unions play an important role. I think we should not interfere with their ability to organize, and that should be available at every workplace where employees choose to do so. So this is not what this is about. And so anybody that's saying that's what this amendment is about is just not true. This is about subsidizing their dues, and that is not being available even to other non-union members who are paying the exact same dues to the same union. So it's not fair. I don't understand. No one has addressed that issue. Why would this deduction be available to union members and not to non-union members? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, is welcome to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the discussion here, again, is timely. I think it's important to note how all of us, I think, want to empower workers. And in the context of history and what the current dynamic is, I know that the agenda from the majority most recently is to compel union membership, to require it as a condition of employment, to do various things to bolster unions writ large, but not in the interest of individual workers. I think it's important to note that our country has done a lot to empower individuals, to improve workplace conditions. I think it's important to note that our Constitution provides for free association. To belong to a group of someone's choosing, that also means that they should be able to choose not to belong to a group either and not lose their job, not lose their livelihood because of that decision.
Discussion here.
And I think looking at modern times, we see workers these days are empowered by social media. We've seen that happen numerous times, and I think that's fine. I might have some other concerns about social media and how some of the preferences that they get. But the fact of the matter is, we need to make sure that our policies are up to date with modern times as it relates to empowering workers as individuals. I know that workers themselves have been disagreeing significantly with their own membership. And I think the last couple of presidential elections have pointed to that. And so I think if we stick to empowering workers as individuals, we're doing the right thing. But if we start picking groups that do things politically one way or another, I think we're headed in the wrong direction. So let's help workers, and we will do right by the American people and our economy and freedom and opportunity. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair is prepared to call the question. All those in favor of the gentleman's amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And Mr. Brady would like a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson?
Thompson, no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer? No. Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kind?
Kind, no.
Mr. Kind votes no. Mr. Pascrell?
Pascal votes no.
Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez votes no.
Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell? Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu?
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle?
No.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer?
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans? Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider?
Schneider, no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi? No. Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta? No. Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy?
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez?
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan, aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed?
Reed, aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly? Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice?
A day.
Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr.
How you
Schweikert?
doing, sweetheart?
Mr. Schweikert votes yes. Ms. Walorski?
Walorski's yes.
Ms. Walorski votes yes. Mr. LaHood?
Yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Wenstrup?
Yes.
Dr. Wenstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington?
Yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker?
Smucker, aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn?
Aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller?
Aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Ms. Sewell?
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes yes. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Anyway.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, I have 25 nays and 18 ayes.
There being 25 nays and 18 ayes, the amendment fails. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a
Chairman?
substitute?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Rice.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Rice has an amendment at the desk. Mr. Thompson?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Mr. Thompson has reserved a point of order, and the amendment will be passed out. The gentleman will be recognized. The gentleman is recognized to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have to reiterate that I know I've said it before in this process, and I know my colleagues have said it as well, but this process is fatally flawed. It is rushed to the point of ridiculousness. It was designed to prevent the minority from even being able to see the exact law until a day or two before these this markup. I hate to call it a hearing because it's really not a hearing, but a markup took place to prevent effective debate. And in this rush to put these ill-suited policies in place, there are so many oversights and mistakes here that if this ever did become law, it would be a disaster. But, you know, that being said, part of the problem here is that I see coming is fraud. And, you know, I think some of these programs are well-intentioned, but there's got to be some kind of guardrails. In numerous meetings with state attorneys general and the Ways and Means Oversight Committee over the years, we've learned over and over again that up to 30% of the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit are fraudulent. The claims are fraudulent. In the American Rescue Plan that's been touted over and over and over again today, in my opinion, it was a disaster, caused far more harm than it did good. Inflation, runaway, people not coming back to work and so forth. But the unemployment, the extended unemployment that we borrowed from our children to pay out to people not to work, up to the estimates are $90 to $400 billion of that was stolen, much of it by international crime rings in Nigeria and Russia. And then on the paid family, and now we have the paid family medical leave that we debated, or not debated, we passed last week. And pursuant to that, as many people can take off as they want, whenever they want, with very little notice and without any verification of need. And the IRS says that they cannot administer it and don't want to administer it. And now we have two new refundable credits, the child tax credit and the advanced premium tax credit, neither one of which requires any verification. So people can just file a form. For the advanced premium tax credit, you know, you have income limits, but we don't require that they file a tax return. For the child tax credit, we don't require that they provide a Social Security number. We don't require that they provide any proof that the child actually lives with the parent who is claiming the credit. So, you know, just based on these things that I've already mentioned, all these refundable credits, there's rampant fraud, and it's not really in question. It's happening every single day. And we're borrowing from these very children we say we're helping here. We're borrowing from them to pay crooks and fraudsters in other countries. I mean, if we're going to borrow from them, from our children to pay our children so they have to pay it back later, which doesn't make any sense anyway. But if we're going to do that, then at least we should try to make sure that the money actually goes to the people we want it to go to, instead of just saying, hey, crooks, rob the U.S. Treasury. It's okay with us. We're not going to require any verification. So that's all my amendment does, is it requires that people file a tax return to make sure that they meet the income requirements if they want the premium tax credit, that they provide a Social Security number and prove the kid lives with them if they want the child tax credit, And it also renames the IRS because we're putting all these new duties on them. And keep in mind, they can't handle the duties they have now. Ask any taxpayer who's tried to contact the IRS. They can't handle what they've got now, and we're putting massive new entitlement programs under their jurisdiction. So if we're going to give them all these duties, you know, I have found that people like titles, and if they take on new duties, they want titles. So we should rename the Internal Revenue Service the Internal Revenue and Welfare Service. So that's the nature of my amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Does Mr. Thompson continue to insist on his point of order?
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order and request time to speak in opposition to this amendment.
Mr. Thompson is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the constant Republican attack against poor and middle-class Americans as looking only to abuse the system really should stop. This amendment and the rhetoric that came along with it really pretty wild. The idea that we're borrowing money to do these programs isn't the case. This bill's paid for. I think maybe the author has this confused with the Republican tax cut bill that borrowed $2.2 trillion from the American people to cut taxes to give on the ultra wealthy. And as far as the IRS not being able to handle what they have now, not surprising. For years, our friends across the aisle have cut the IRS to the bone, to the bone. One of the things we do in this bill is provide funding for the IRS so they can do their job and prevent some of the wealthiest people in the country from cheating on their taxes. Bottom line is, this bill has protections against fraud and reckless claims. This should be rejected out of hand, and I yield back.
I believe Ms. Sanchez would like to be recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that Mr. Thompson has said. It's very clear that the author is confused about this amendment because the tax system is not an immigration system. If you live in this country, you have to file and pay taxes, and nothing in our bill changes that fact. Every taxpayer who lives in this country and who files their tax returns and meets the requirement should be entitled to the credit, whether or not they file with a Social Security number or with an ITIN. And what this amendment does is it seeks to harm children when their parents are earning and paying taxes on the money that they earn. If they meet the requirements for the child tax credit, they should be entitled to receive it. That is how the tax code works, and I won't belabor the point, but I think it's very mean-spirited because it's clearly aimed at attacking people of color, and with that, I will yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice.
Thank you to Mr. Smith and the chairman. I'm not intending to be mean-spirited in any way. All I want is for the credit that is being subsidized by American taxpayers to go to American citizens. I don't think that's mean-spirited in any sense, and I think the vast majority of the American public would agree with that. And second, July the 20th, that warns that fraudsters are stealing the tax credit, the child tax credit, in tax-related scams that arose under the American Rescue Plan. It's happening already. We know it's happening already. To ignore it is to simply stick your head in the sand and to say, hey, it's okay if Russian mobsters and Nigerian hucksters steal from the American taxpayers, money that we intended to go to American citizens. We're fine with that. We're not going to require any eligibility requirements, you know, and we're going to put on the IRS the responsibility of verifying this when, in fact, they can't handle what they've got already. They don't want the job, and they've said they can't handle the job. And finally, in response to what Mr. Thompson said earlier, that we're not borrowing the money, we borrowed every dime of the money that came in the American Rescue Plan. It was 100% unfunded. We borrowed $5,500 for every man, woman, and child in this country. For a family of four, we borrowed $22,000. And we gave them back a check for $1,400. We borrowed $5,500 and we gave them back a check for $1,400. That is a great government entitlement program for you. You know, yeah, guys, we're going to do you a great service. We're going to take care of you. Government can take care of you. Let's go borrow $22,000 in the name of your family. Of course, your kids are going to pay that back, and we'll give you back $1,400 of it. Isn't that a great deal? Vote for us. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I speak in strong opposition to this amendment. First, efforts to limit this tax credit to only children with Social Security numbers ignore the integral role that immigrants play in our economy. Immigrants contribute to our tax base and our communities. An analysis from the Center for American Progress finds that each year, undocumented workers and their households pay $79.7 billion in federal tax contributions and $41 billion in state and local tax contributions. These tax dollars fund public schools, infrastructure repairs for roads and bridges, and the military. Second, and this is a very important point, all immigrant children have been eligible for the child tax credit since its inception in 1995. That is well over 20 years. It was only recently in the 2017 Republican tax bill that they decided they needed to further demonize immigrants by imposing a Social Security requirement on children to receive this benefit. So we are correcting that injustice today on behalf of nearly 1 million immigrant children across the country, including the Afghan refugees that my Republican colleagues have expressed such a desire to help get established in the U.S. Because this amendment would hurt those very same families. I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Gomez, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it interesting that my Republican colleagues keep introducing amendments to undermine the effectiveness of the child tax credit. First, if their child tax credit was so effective, then the one we passed wouldn't be reducing child poverty in this country by 50%. So it shows that their tax credit was far inferior to what we are proposing and have implemented to date. Additionally, the child tax credit in this bill does have protections against fraud and reckless claims. But for some reason, my Republican colleagues always want to attack the working poor, the working class, and defend the largest corporations in this country, instead of trying to figure out how do we help them. They claim to be about family values. You know, I have families in my district, like my mother and father, who worked 4 or 5 jobs a week to make ends meet, to put food on the table, to teach us the value of hard work. But they were gone from morning until the evening, and nobody was there to make sure that we, did our homework. No one was there to make sure that we stayed out of their trouble, but we did. Wouldn't it be better if somebody didn't have to work that extra job because of the child tax credit? I think it would be. I think that's what family values is about. Also, I have a simple question. In some states across the country, like West Virginia, there's a 19.6% child poverty rate in West Virginia in 2019. And under this bill, under the child tax credit that we passed, it was going to cut child poverty by 43%. That means less kids in poverty. That means less kids going hungry. That means less kids suffering. So my question is, when you add a requirement, what is an acceptable percentage? You know, maybe another 10% of the children are back in poverty. Is that okay with you? Is more kids going hungry? Is that okay with you? Because in where I come from, it's not. It's not. To make sure that this has a profound impact on families, we should not make any changes except to pass an expansion so that more families can benefit. And in that way, we will have not only a stronger communities, stronger families, but a stronger America. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief. I hope that we would reject this amendment. This is just yet another amendment that's been offered today that represents just yet another opportunity to slap, to defame those people who are poor, and in this case, those people who are parents of children. I am very proud of the fact that this the CTC, EITC have provisions built into them to extract accountability from its recipients. But I do think it's rather curious that we've had a great deal of rejection of our ideas to find accountability among the $500 billion per year that we experience in a tax gap from higher income individuals and corporations, that we are reluctant to hire IRS agents to track down that substantial amount of money. And yet we're focused in like a laser beam on some immigrant or some baby daddy that might get the EITC or the child tax credit. I mean, it just speaks to our complete resentment of people who are in need. With regard to this notion that somehow these transfer payments traps people in poverty and prevents them from working. These payments, as many have indicated today, really enables children to be healthier, to learn more, to be contributing members of our society, and it does, in fact, increase employability among those parents. I just want to point out that when we ended welfare as we knew it in 1996, deep poverty among children is up since that time, greater than it was in 1996. So I'm very pleased that we have these provisions in our bill today, very proud of it. We do want accountability, but we want accountability from those folks who are the tax cheats, not accountability from innocent babies and kids who benefit from this tax policy. And with that, I would yield back.
The gentleman from, Mr. Kelly is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're all getting to the point, and there's only one or two amendments left, but Mr. Rice is trying to prevent these payments that are fraudulent, improper payments are being taken care of. So the intent of the program is to help children. I mean, right, the PDC and the CTC, this is all to help children. But I think the American people would like to know that their money is actually going to the people who deserve it. So if we don't have any oversight, and then we sit back and look and say, geez, look how much money is going in improper payments. There's nobody who would work out of their own checkbook or their own wallet that would say, it doesn't really matter that the money I just gave you isn't being given or isn't being used for the reason I gave it to you, because I'm all right with that. What the hell's wrong with you people? So when we start to protect hardworking American taxpayers and the money they put in, all of a sudden it's about you don't want to take care of these children. That's not the case at all. We do want to take care of the children. We do want to do these things. What do you think was in our Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? Everything we put in was to help somebody in America and to make their lives a little bit simpler and make it a little bit easier for them. Mr. Rice isn't trying to take advantage of people who are getting these payments that deserve them. What he's saying is, shouldn't there be some oversight? Shouldn't there be somebody actually checking to make sure that these funds are going to those who they are intended for and not fraudulent? Of course, in a country where we look at, well, geez, you know, only 25 or 30% of it's going to the wrong people, I think that's a pretty good record for us in the United States government. I mean, that's only, I don't know, $4.5 billion a year for one program and maybe $5 billion for the other. That's not that much considering what all it is that we throw around. Have we become that numb to the fact, and I pointed this out the other day, we are so far in debt we can't see our way out of this hole. I told you it was the Titanic moment. You think it's fun to keep spending this money and say, well, here's why we're doing it, because we're trying to help people. Trying to help people, burying them in debt that they'll never be able to get out of? That's your idea of trying to help people? We want to help people who deserve help, but we also need to have oversight on it. Nobody using their own money out of their own account, their personal account, would just say, I don't really care that the money I gave was not being used for the reason I gave it, because I just think I'm that great of a person, I can do that. That's absolute stupidity. Mr. Rice is doing the right thing for the right reason, so we can make sure that every single penny we give out to those people who deserve it, get it, and it doesn't go to somebody else. When the heck did we ever look at a business model that's saying 25 to 30% fraudulent or improper payments? That's a really good business model. I tell you, and I said this before, I wish you people were running a car store beside me. I would love to see you put yourselves out of business and let me take your customers. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlemen, would the gentleman yield briefly?
Yes, I will, Chairman.
No, I thank you, Mr. Kelly. I'll be very brief. Look, I think this should be a bipartisan issue. We should be as interested in closing the fraud gap as we are in closing the tax gap. You know, we know there may be up to $400 billion of fraud in the pandemic unemployment insurance program. We tried to stop it, and our Democrat colleagues weren't interested. We know there could be $200 billion or more of fraud in the child tax credit, earned income tax. It's going to people who aren't eligible. Why don't we work together and close that fraud gap? That's more money for services for people who need it. And while I appreciate the lecture on the working poor, I would point out last night every Democrat here voted to insist on $300 billion of tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires and denied moving that money to zero tax rates for the working poor. And I would remind our Democrat colleagues in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that single mom with 2 kids, that waitress, server, saved her $1,300 a year. They voted against it. And when we doubled the child tax credit and expanded it to a lot more families, you vote against that as well. And so I think since the child tax credit was created by a Republican Congress and was an element of helping people work their way out of poverty, we believe one of the smartest things we can do is work together to end the fraud, make sure it goes to those who are eligible, and save those dollars either for paying down the debt or creating the right services and doing it the right way. With that, Mr. Kelly, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the ranking member's desire to stop fraud. Of course, we all want to do that, but this is just not the way to do it. So I'm in opposition to this amendment because it makes it harder for children, especially in my community, especially immigrant children of hardworking families in my community, to get these types of benefits. Now, having been raised on the Central Coast of California with those who took the risk to come to our home, to contribute to our economy, to our community, and yes, to our culture, it's those working families who should be able to avail themselves of the benefits offered for their children, despite their immigration status. Farm workers in my community, the farm workers in your communities, they put food on our tables. They contribute to our food security, especially during this pandemic. And yes, they deserve these types of benefits. Why wouldn't we provide them to them? Why wouldn't we provide these types of benefits to their children? I should also note that it's these immigrants who pay into these benefits, yet they don't get them back. They pay taxes into our system, and many of them don't have the opportunity for these types of critical benefits, from Social Security to the child tax credit to the earned income tax credits. They don't make much, let me tell you, but boy, do they work hard for their families, for their future, to obtain the American dream. And I believe it's our obligation to ensure that they have that opportunity, and the child tax credits and availing them of these types of benefits is just part of how we can do that. That's why I'm opposed to this amendment, and I hope my colleagues would oppose it as well. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much. We know that the discussion about fraud in programs or in these type of tax credits are something that our Republican colleagues have really made a great deal of effort to push out to the American people, which are not backed up by data. They've done the same thing with TANF programs, with SNAP programs, with food stamps, and school lunch programs, which the data does not bear out to show that there is an exorbitant amount of fraud. There's more fraud in your donors and your tax individuals, the high-paid individuals who are doing illegal activity to try and circumvent their payments. But one of the things that was talked about was the bottom line and the economics. What we really also need to understand is that this does cost our children if we do not take care of poverty, that it does have a financial bearing on us on the long term if we do not. Before the recession, on a yearly basis, we lost $500 billion per year in lost labor for individuals who were in poverty. There was a percentage, 30% of children who are poor do not graduate or complete high school, which in turn leads them to not be active contributors to our society. High rates of poverty exact a serious toll on the U.S. economy. Each year, child poverty reduces productivity and income output by about 1.3% of our gross domestic product. If we are concerned about our children's future, we should be concerned about those children whom will be in society with them. The children who are the poor now, who, if we help them now, can be productive members of our society and reach the American dream and be part of a production and continue American ingenuity. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair is prepared to call the question. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, and members are reminded to unmute themselves for this voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
A recorded vote is requested.
Mr. Brady has requested a recorded vote, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett?
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson?
Thompson, no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer?
Blumenauer, no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kind?
Thank you.
Mr. Kind?
Kind, no.
Mr. Kind votes no. Mr. Pascrell?
Pascal, no.
Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell?
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu?
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee? No. Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle?
No.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer?
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans?
Evans votes no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider?
Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi? No. Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy?
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Brady?
Brady?
Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez?
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunes votes aye. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed?
Reed votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert votes aye. Ms. Walorski?
Walorski votes aye.
Ms. Walorski votes aye. Mr. LaHood?
Hood is aye.
Mr. LaHood votes aye. Dr. Wenstrup?
Dr. Wenstrup is aye.
Dr. Wenstrup votes aye. Mr. Arrington?
Arrington's a yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker?
Aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn?
Hearn votes aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller?
Aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, I have 25 nays and 18 ayes.
There being 25 nays and 18 ayes, the amendment fails. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Ferguson.
I have an amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Thompson.
I reserve a point of order.
Mr. Thompson has reserved a point of order, and the gentleman from Georgia will be recognized as quickly as the amendment is passed out. The gentleman is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we saw something remarkable that happened throughout America. We saw so many new small business owners. We saw so many different types of business owners, innovators, people growing businesses, and we saw the lowest unemployment among our Latino community, our African American community, Americans of color. It was really quite remarkable to see the advancement. And in my district, I know many folks that prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act really struggled to start, operate, and grow a business, and they found tremendous success. And we want to make sure that that success continues to find them and that they are able to contribute more and more and more to the American experience and our American economy. So my amendment is pretty simple. It would require the Secretary of the Treasury to certify that changes to the 199A small business deduction will not force the closure of small businesses eligible for the Small Business Administration Small Disadvantaged Business Program. So this is something that we want to make sure that before these tax increases go into effect, that we understand that and we have confidence that it won't hurt our socially disadvantaged small business community. So I will urge adoption of this amendment. Mr. Chairman, as we've gone through this process, it's been pretty evident that this has been a partisan exercise. You know, when President Biden was campaigning, he campaigned on an era of bipartisanship coming into Congress, but what we have not seen one bit of that here today. Really, we haven't seen it over the last 3 days of markups. And what we have seen 4 days, and my colleague from New York just reminded me, it almost feels like 3 years, doesn't it, Mr. Swazi? We have not seen a level of cooperation here. We have offered many amendments to make this bill better, to make sure that there are provisions in here that protect small businesses, that maintain American competitiveness, that incentivize work, that help people go from poverty into the middle class and beyond. Every single one of our amendments has been rejected. Now, I heard Mr. Smith from Missouri say something that I think is right. I just don't think that the majority had the time to call the speaker and ask permission to vote on some really good amendments. And that just seems apparent because we are in a very, very partisan environment right now, and it's a shame for the American people. I want to draw back for 1 second. I want to talk about what we just saw in the last amendment that was defeated, and it was offered by Mr. Rice from South Carolina. If you don't think that there is fraud in that program, then you are living in blissful ignorance. And blissful ignorance is no excuse for theft of taxpayer dollars. It does exist, and it should not exist. And whether you are a billionaire that are cheating your taxes, or whether you're committing fraud, taking money from our most vulnerable citizens that we are trying to help succeed, you should be, number one, you should be caught, and number two, you should be locked up. Doesn't matter, thief, if you steal a nickel or $1 billion, you're still a thief. And so I would hope that this committee would be fully committed over a period of time to working in a bipartisan fashion to find a way to close the fraud gap. I would be supportive of that, and I know that many of my colleagues on this side of the aisle would as well. But we've got to work, and we should be working in a bipartisan fashion, but instead we've taken a partisan tack that is going to do several things. It is going to make America less competitive. It is going to ruin innovation in this country. It is going to put the American worker at a competitive disadvantage. It will close many small businesses. It will give our enemies and our adversaries around the world an upper hand, and we are surrendering our global competitiveness to a global minimum tax. I submit that we should be doing everything that we can to put the American worker first, to put American innovators first, American small businesses, and we should be doing everything we can to put this great country first. Unfortunately, the Democrats' plan is everybody first but America. Enough is enough. It's time to vote for this amendment and defeat this overall package. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Does the gentleman from California continue to insist upon his point of order?
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order and ask to be recognized.
The gentleman from California is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To quote the great Yogi Berra, this is deja vu all over again. We've had this amendment up before us already today, and I'll say again what I said then. Half of the tax savings of the 199A accrues to the top 1% of taxpayers, and that's according to Treasury Department research. Our bill preserves $500,000 worth of 199A deduction for every single taxpayer. That corresponds to the maximum deduction that would have been possible for a pass-through business owner with $2.5 million of taxable income. The provision will continue to provide a powerful benefit for the taxpayers it was meant to support. We don't need this amendment. I urge a no vote. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in favor of this amendment. You know, supporting small businesses is so important to this country. As we're coming out of the pandemic, we need to make sure that these small businesses who've suffered so much can get the support that they need for this. You know, the 199A provision is something that was so important that we put through with the TCJA, and making sure that the provisions of how that could be utilized were helpful for small businesses. It's kind of sad that this bill that's been pulled together today, actually in some cases up to double the tax rate that's on small businesses versus C corporations. I know this hastily pulled together bill has a lot of things that don't make sense and in terms of how it's impacting people. And instead of focusing on what we should be doing to get the economy going, it focuses on giveaways, it focuses on big taxes, it focuses away on making the wealthy millionaires have better tax results than they do now under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions. In addition to that, it really doesn't help the economy. And it also cuts into what President Biden promised when he was campaigning. You know, the Joint Committee on Taxation has found that 2/3 of Biden's corporate tax rate will be felt by middle-income taxpayers, including small businesses that file as taxes as individuals. The JCT, Joint Committee on Taxation, also estimated that it will lower federal revenues by around $1.2 trillion over the next decade, versus what was accomplished with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which actually did just the opposite and increased federal revenues over what the CBO had estimated. So this hastily pulled together Democrat bill is doing several things, and I just want to highlight as a problem area when we look at those. It's going to ship American jobs overseas because of the provisions they're focusing on, the tax treatment of our multinational corporations. Already talked about the attack on small businesses and the damage it's going to do to small businesses versus the giveaways to the larger corporations. And it really just expands big government. One of the things that really stands out on this is, we've talked about prior to COVID shutdown, income inequality was decreasing because of the economy and the way the economy was growing and moving forward. Unfortunately, during coronavirus pandemic and the shutdown, we have seen some losses from the accomplishments that we gained with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and income inequality has actually gotten slightly worse in that regards. Unfortunately, this big government expansion is not going to help that. It's going to make more people dependent upon government and not able to get out and take the advantage of a growing economy and help to raise more money for themselves, their families, and care for that. So I just want to encourage support for this amendment, but let's change this overall bill. Let's fix what the problems are before we try to squeeze this hastily pulled together Democrat bill forward. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce for the record a Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration report dated May 10th, 2021, titled Improper Payment Rates for Refundable Tax Credits Remain High. This report makes clear to those on the other side that we do have data, actually, to support our fraud concerns. Mr. Chairman, I would also like to submit for the record a Department of Labor Inspector General report dated October 20th, 2021, titled COVID-19 State Site Vulnerabilities in Detecting Fraud While Complying with the CARES Act Unemployment Program Self-Certification Requirement.
Without objection.
And the Department of Labor Inspector General, not us, has estimated at least $89 billion, that's with a B, billion, in fraud in pandemic unemployment programs. That's hardly Mr. Rice proposing something that was just kind of, well, I think I'll just throw that in there. The data's here, the facts are here, the reports are here. I would invite our friends on the other side, please take a look at this stuff before you say we don't know what we're talking about.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Smith is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our colleagues. Certainly thank you to Mr. Ferguson for his introduction of the small business amendment here. I think that we would be remiss if we did not focus on what small businesses do for our country, for our economy, for workers, for communities. And numerous times since we passed TCJA, I've been pulled aside by small business folks in my district who say thank you. It allowed them to expand. It allowed them to plan for the future, to provide more opportunities for folks in their community. I'll say it again. We have such an abundance of vacant job openings, and you all see the pictures, now hiring, but it goes deeper than that. It goes much deeper than just entry-level work opportunities. And I hope that we can ultimately defeat this legislation because it's a disaster waiting to happen and would be bad for opportunity for Americans across the country. We've engaged now for several hours. It might seem like a long time, but I would say it's not enough given the magnitude of the bill. Magnitude as described by my colleagues on the other side, because they feel that it is the cure-all that will change weather patterns, that it will solve any problem our country has been facing. Yet it's roundly dismissive
of the most obvious challenges our country faces, and that is the abundance of job vacancies. As some of my colleagues have shared, I am concerned that even the decisions we make in committee here, even the lockout of Republican amendments that have taken place over the last 4 years, or 4 days, sorry about that, well, actually, last 2.5 years. We've been shut out on amendments, and you control the process. That's your prerogative as the majority. But I all too vividly recall that when we had a markup here in this committee, I think roughly 2 years ago, we had a compromise. We had a bill move out of this committee with some components to it that drew absolutely no opposition or concern in this committee. And once it got to the Speaker's office, she thought otherwise. She made sure that it got changed. And I hope that every single committee member here is offended by that. I'm certainly offended by it today, as it's an extension now that this committee has gotten its marching orders from the Speaker of the House, the White House, the Senate leader. All the while, the work here is likely to be changed. Of course, ultimately, I hope it's defeated. But even the work done here is likely to be changed significantly. We've already gotten heads up that the SALT cap is going to be at least partially repealed. I'm speculating. We see other signs that there are things that are going to be changed rather drastically. But the marching orders are given by the Speaker of the House, who I would argue is the most divisive speaker in modern history. She's got her agenda. Now, that's her prerogative. I would hope that we, as self-respecting members of the Ways and Means Committee, will do all that we can to maintain our prerogative as a committee. But as we focus on, I hope, building opportunity for America, not just for current folks, but future generations, that we will focus on policy. As Mr. Brady has often said, we shouldn't wait for once every 30 years to adopt a tax code that creates more opportunity and expansion for the future. We can do far better than waiting every 30 years like we did the last time. But growing government and the reach of government is not the way to go. I hope we can adopt this amendment, defeat the bill, and save America in the process.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Missouri, the other Mr. Smith, is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right now, our country is facing numerous crises that have all been created by Washington Democrats and the Biden administration. Whether it is the border crisis, whether it's the energy crisis, or whether it's the inflation crisis. All those crises are affecting Americans. However, what we have before us in the largest, most gigantic spending bill in the history of the United States, the largest tax increase in the history of the United States. This reconciliation package, this $3.5 trillion tax and spending spree, only makes those three crises worse. It doesn't help the American people. It only makes all of those even worse. If you want to try to figure out how do you compare the amount of spending in this package, the best way to do it is you could build the national interstate highway system in today's dollars 7 complete times. Every interstate in America, in today's dollars, 7 times. That is what this package does. You could fund our military 5 times. You could fund Medicare for a year 5 times with just the spending in this bill. Virtually everything that Washington Democrats propose in this $3.5 trillion tax and spending bill benefits wealthy coastal elites, special interest allies, their political friends, allies, and donors. But you know, it's all at the expense of working class Americans. It's all at the expense of working class Americans. Gas prices are up 80% since January 20th in my home state as the direct result of Democrats and Joe Biden's executive orders and the policies moving forward. This legislation will only drive their gas prices up higher. When they are struggling right now to put food on their table, clothes on their backs, and gas in their cars. We are facing the highest inflation since 1981 because of the reckless spending this administration, the House Democrats have done. In fact, to tell you how bad of the spending, if this bill is enacted, if this $3.5 trillion bill is enacted, just in the last 18 months, the Democrats will have spent more money than the entire wages of all Americans in a year. Think about that. The American people. Since the Democrats have been in control of the House of Representatives, in the last 18 months, if this bill passes, they will have spent all of the wages of all Americans for a year. I asked the Americans, do you want to be taxed at 100+%? Because the Democrats, that's what they'd have to do just to pay for their spending in the last 18 months. But guess what? You're going to be taxed. 2/3 of low-income and middle-income Americans will face the burden of these tax increases. 2/3 of low-income and middle-income Americans will face the burden of the proposals that you have before you. What a wasteful bill. It's the wrong plan at the wrong time for all the wrong reasons. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman has yielded back his time, and the chair is prepared to call for a vote on this amendment. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for a voice vote. Those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
A recorded vote.
Brady has requested a recorded vote.
Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Thompson?
Thompson, no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson?
No.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer?
Blumenauer, no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind? Mr. Pascrell?
Pascal votes no.
Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell?
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu? Ms. Moore,
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Ms.
Mr.
Moore,
Chairman?
Yes.
This is Gwen Moore. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
How am I recorded?
At the moment, you're not.
This is Gwen Moore voting no.
Appreciate that reinforcement.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer.
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans.
Evans vote no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider.
Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi. Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy.
Would the clerk suspend for a moment? I'm informed that some of the online people can't hear you. I can see Ms. Chu, for example. She's visible. Okay, would you proceed? Yeah, would you test the mic, please?
Ms. Murphy.
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Brady?
Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez?
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan, aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska?
Smith, aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed?
Reed votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice?
Aye.
Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert votes aye. Ms. Walorski?
Walorski votes aye.
Ms. Walorski votes aye. Mr. LaHood?
LaHood, yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Wenstrup?
Wenstrup, yes.
Dr. Wenstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington?
Arrington, yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker?
Aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn?
Aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller?
Aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Kind?
Kind, no.
Mr. Kind votes no. Ms. Chu?
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman votes no.
Excuse me, this is Gwen Moore. How am I recorded?
Repeatedly.
Okay.
The clerk will report how Ms. Moore is recorded.
Ms. Moore is recorded as a no.
No. Thank you, Ms. Moore.
Mr. Chairman, I have the final.
The clerk will report the roll, the tally.
Mr. Chairman, I have 25 nays and 18 ayes.
25 nays and 18 ayes. The amendment fails. If there are no further amendments, the question is now on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
Aye.
In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Now let me recognize Mr. Thompson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report the committee print consisting of subtitles F, G, H, and J as amended to the Committee on Budget.
The question is on transmitting the committee print as amended to the House Committee on the Budget. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for the voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to, and the committee print as amended is ordered transmitted to the House Committee on the Budget.
Mr. Chairman, we would ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll. But before the clerk calls the roll, I want to remind members that we will have one final vote after this one to report all the materials to the Budget Committee, so please stay in the room and/or logged in. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Doggett? Aye. Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson?
Thompson, aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Blumenauer?
Blumenauer, aye.
Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kind?
Kind, aye.
Mr. Kind votes aye. Mr. Pascrell?
Yes, today, to preserve democracy. Put that in your pipe.
Mr. Pascrell votes yes and also preserves democracy. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez?
Hell yes.
Ms. Sanchez votes hell yes. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Ms. Sewell?
Sewell votes yes, yes.
Ms. Sewell votes yes. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes aye. Ms. Chu?
Chu votes aye.
Ms. Chu votes aye. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes aye.
Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee votes aye. Mr. Boyle?
Yes.
Mr. Boyle votes yes. Mr. Byer?
Byer votes aye.
Mr. Byer votes aye. Mr. Evans?
Yes.
Mr. Evans votes yes. Mr. Schneider?
Schneider, yes.
Mr. Schneider votes yes. Mr. Swazi? Mr. Swazi votes yes. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta votes aye. Ms. Murphy?
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez votes aye. Mr. Horsford?
For the people, Horsford votes aye.
Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Plaskett?
Plaskett votes aye.
Ms. Plaskett votes aye. Mr. Brady?
Mr. Brady votes no.
Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Nunez?
Nunes votes no.
Mr. Nunez votes no. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan, no.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Reed?
Reed votes no.
Mr. Reed votes no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri?
In bipartisan fashion, I vote no.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no. Mr. Rice?
Mr. Rice votes no.
Mr. Rice votes no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert votes no. Ms. Walorski?
Walorski votes no.
Ms. Walorski votes no. Mr. LaHood?
No.
Mr. LaHood votes no. Dr. Wenstrup?
No.
Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Arrington?
Arrington's a no.
Mr. Arrington votes no. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Smucker?
No.
Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Hearn?
No.
Mr. Hearn votes no. Mrs. Miller?
No.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman votes yes.
Yes. The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, I have 24 ayes and 19 noes.
There being 24 ayes and 19 noes, the matter is passed and agreed to, and the committee print is ordered transmitted to the House Committee on the Budget. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the print, and members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Let me now, at a point of personal privilege, recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Brady, before we turn to the final motion without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have worked long and hard these 4 days of the markup. Debate has been tough but respectful. I want to commend you, Chairman, and every member of this committee in both parties, in person and virtually, for a debate that was passionate but professional in what we know will have a major impact on every American today. If you ask why we worry so much and have fought so hard against these policies, I got an email from a small business person in the Woodlands, Mayor Lou, who wrote me, I am deeply concerned by the ongoing discussion to increase federal taxes and mandates on businesses. Actually, I'm petrified with fear. These tax increases and mandates will harm the fragile small businesses recovering from the pandemic. Throughout the last 18 months, people like me who actually produce and work have struggled while trying to keep our businesses afloat. You're in an important position to help protect small businesses and entrepreneurs. Please avoid tax increases and mandates that will harm small businesses in Texas and across the country. Mr. Chairman, I think we've been very direct and clear. You know, in our belief as Republicans and conservatives, we believe that our government is wasting so much to kill so many American jobs. We will drive prices even higher and hook a whole new generation of the poor on government dependency. This is, in our view, an economic surrender to countries that don't deserve it. China, Russia, Europe, and Japan, who are cheering this. This will fuel inflation even further and, in our view and estimation, raise taxes on the middle class and small business and breaks President Biden's pledge to not tax Americans making less than $400,000. We understand this bill will change as the process goes forward. We'll continue to fight for a stronger economy, for less inflation, and to lift people out of poverty the right way. We know that there will not likely be a time for bipartisan work, but should there ever be at any point in this bill, we stand ready to sit down with you at the table to find a better way forward. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I want to thank all members of the committee for the principled manner in which this debate was undertaken. And let me thank Kevin Brady, again, for the way he managed the opposition, always respectful of the traditions of this committee. So we, over these 4 long days and now 40 hours of debate through 66 amendments, have gone back and forth over measures that I believe will improve the lives of all Americans. From 12 weeks of universal paid leave, medical leave, to incentivizing the development and use of green energy in an effort to combat climate change. All of these measures are grounded in the goal of growing our economy and making it more inclusive and sustainable for the future. It's notable that we are advancing this historic slate of life-changing measures on the same day that millions of families received their 3rd installment of the expanded child tax credit. This tax cut is a proven tool to help families afford necessities to support economic growth and indeed to reduce childhood poverty. We are responsibly funding these policies by simply asking those who have done quite well just to pay a little bit more so that all members of the American family can share in the dignity, stability, dreams, and aspirations of this great nation. As parts, each individual measure we've approved of has the potential to change lives. Taken together, these investments will transform our society to be more prosperous, equitable, and fair. It's what the American people deserve, a broader opportunity. This markup indeed has been historic, but we won't stop until President Biden has signed this package into law. Now is not the time to skimp on these investments. These are standards that Democrats should be setting, and the nation indeed, I believe, is on our side. I want to thank the many people who have worked tirelessly to make this possible. I thank all of our colleagues for their service and engagement, and I always want to thank the terrific staff of the Ways and Means Committee, our family. This committee, once again, worked around the clock through pandemic, through enormous challenges, but they came through for our country in this time of crisis. And we are all very grateful to the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Congressional Budget Office, as well as the Office of the Legislative Counsel. Building Back Better is well within reach, and I urge our colleagues to support these critical provisions. Now let me recognize my friend, Mr. Thompson, as he offers a final motion. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee do now transmit the recommendations of this committee and all appropriate accompanying material, including additional, supplemental, or dissenting views, to the House Committee on the Budget in order to comply with the reconciliation directive included in Section 2002 of the concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2022, S-Con Res 14, and consistent with Section 310 of the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974.
The question is on transmitting the recommendations of this committee and all appropriate accompanying material, including additional supplemental or dissenting views, to the Committee on the Budget. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for the voice vote. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, signify by saying no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and the recommendations are ordered transmitted to the House Committee on the Budget.
On that, I ask a recorded vote.
Mr. Brady has requested a recorded vote, and the clerk will please call the roll. Members are reminded that your cameras should be on, and please mute yourself until the clerk calls your name.
Mr. Doggett?
Doggett votes aye.
Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson?
Thompson, aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson?
Yes.
Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Blumenauer?
Blumenauer, aye.
Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kind?
Kind, aye.
Mr. Kind votes aye. Mr. Pascrell?
Pascrell votes aye.
Mr. Pascrell votes aye. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez votes oh, yes.
Ms. Sanchez votes oh, yes. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Ms. Sewell?
Sewell votes yes.
Ms. Sewell votes yes. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes aye. Ms. Chu?
Chu votes aye.
Ms. Chu votes aye. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes aye.
Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kildee?
Kildee votes aye.
Mr. Kildee votes aye. Mr. Boyle?
Boyle votes yes.
Mr. Boyle votes yes. Mr. Byer?
Byer votes aye.
Mr. Byer votes aye. Mr. Evans?
Evans vote yes.
Mr. Evans votes yes. Mr. Schneider?
Snyder votes aye.
Mr. Schneider votes aye. Mr. Swazi? Yes. Mr. Swazi votes yes. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta votes yes. Ms. Murphy?
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez votes aye. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Plaskett? Ms. Plaskett votes aye. Mr. Brady?
Brady votes no.
Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Nunez?
Nunes votes no.
Mr. Nunez votes no. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan votes no.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska?
Smith votes no.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Reed?
Reed, no.
Mr. Reed votes no. Mr. Kelly? No. Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri?
Smith votes no.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no. Mr. Rice?
No. Mr. Rice votes no.
Mr. Rice votes no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert votes aye. Ms. Walorski?
Walorski votes no.
Ms. Walorski votes no. Mr. LaHood?
LaHood is a no.
Mr. LaHood votes no. Dr. Wenstrup?
Wenstrup votes no.
Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Arrington?
Arrington's a no.
Mr. Arrington votes no. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Smucker?
No.
Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Hearn?
Hearn votes no.
Mr. Hearn votes no. Mrs. Miller?
No.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye. Mr. Schweikert, you are recorded as a yes. Mr. Schweikert votes no.
Is there anybody who wishes to change their vote for the first time in 4 days? Would the clerk please report the roll? Call.
Mr. Chairman, I have 24 ayes and 19 noes.
There being 24 ayes and 19 noes, the motion is agreed, and the recommendations are ordered transmitted to the House Committee on the Budget. There being no further business before the Committee on Ways and Means, the committee stands adjourned. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks.